All right. So, why are so many people leaving the church? I'm not just talking about our church, but I'm talking about the church in general. Specifically, I'm talking about the church in the United States. If you were to go to Pew Research, which I did this week, you'll find that for the first time in our history, since the 1930s or 1940s, probably when they first started doing surveys, for the first time in the year 2020, people with a religious affiliation have become a minority. For many years, it used to run along this plane of about 70% of people would claim that they had a religious affiliation of some point, but this year, last year, in the year 2020, we hit the lowest point ever, 47%. So why is that? This was the question that was asked to a Catholic bishop, a bishop that we'll just call Bishop Barron, okay? He's a bishop in the Los Angeles area, and he's really a great thinker. And so the host of the podcast that I was listening to asked him this question, why is the church bleeding people? And obviously this is a multifaceted issue. It's not just a simple, this is what's wrong and we can fix that. And so he and the host talked about the difficulty that people, and especially young people, are having being able to reconcile things like science with the biblical literature. And they went on to talk too about how postmodernism has had its effect and how people struggle to deal with objective and subjective truth, and how do we interpret Scripture in view of these two things. But then they got on a concept that really caught my attention, and they said, what if the church isn't being heroic enough? What if it isn't calling people to truly live a life that is heroic, that has meaning, that it isn't inviting them on this sense of adventure that many people crave? So I'll go ahead and flip the slide, Dale. And it came down to this, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but their basic premise was it's not that the church demands too much of people, but that it demands too little. Now, I want us to think about that and wrestle with that. So I was doing some research for one of my courses that I need to take this summer, and it dealt with some of the history and development of the early church, okay? And so they were talking about the period, the first, second, third centuries, CE, AD, whatever initials you want to use for those, and they talked about how long it took someone after they had kind of made a claim to faith, how long it took them to become baptized and become part of the church. You guys have any idea how long that period was? About 3 years from the time that they made a confession to invite Jesus to be their Lord and Savior to the time they became a member of the church. Now, why is that? Well, again, think about the context that they live in, right? They lived under an oppressive Roman government, and oftentimes an aggressive government that sought to persecute them for their religion. And so part of the process for them was to train them, to make sure that they were equipped to withstand the persecution that they may face. Because it does no good for them to bring in a bunch of quote-unquote converts only to have them run right back out the door as soon as the Roman government comes seeking people. I also read a story this week about a lady who had gone and done work in Cuba. And again, the Cuban government, very hostile towards Christianity for much of the period under Castro. And so they had trouble bringing people to church because people were afraid. And finally, once some of the restrictions lifted, the people that were working in these churches began to create a 52-week membership course. Not baptism, just membership course. If you wanted to be a member in this church, it required 52 weeks of preparation. Now, let's be honest, how many of us are going to be excited about spending 2 to 3 hours a week for 52 weeks just to become a member of the church? Probably not very many of us, right? But one of the things I want us to think about, and one of the things I want us to wrestle with, is this idea, again, of are we demanding too little of people, and what happens when we do that? Well, guess what? We begin to limit their possibilities. We begin to limit their potential, and when they can't find that desire for them to grow and to find a place and that they can contribute to, why would they stay? And so we find more and more people going out of our churches looking for other opportunities where they feel like they can have a meaningful contribution, right? I'll give us one more example to think about before we move into our scripture, and that is, many of you have worked with kids, right? At some point or another, many of us has worked with kids. What happens when we raise expectations on kids? Actually, the kids almost always rise to the level of the expectations that are set, as long as they're healthy and within reason, right? Expectations can become burdensome. But if you have healthy, reasonable expectations, kids will almost always rise up to that level. So why do we think it's any different when it comes to us as adults? Why has the church moved into this period of passivity and scarcity that says, you know what, I don't want to be a burden to you, and why don't you maybe check us out? Come on, you can do a one-night membership class and be part of our church. Why aren't we coming and saying, you know what, let's prepare you for the life, for the adventure that is your Christian walk. Okay, let's raise the bar and be intentional and have accountability along the way to say, you know what, we value you so much and we value the person that you could become that we're going to invest time and energy into you. But are you going to be willing to make the commitment? Okay, and Dale, go ahead and go to our next slide. So let's look at a verse from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. And I think this hits the nail on the head. Jesus is talking to his disciples and he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. Now let's deal with the first part of that verse. If each and every one of us take that verse seriously, what does that mean? I think honestly, if we think about it, that verse kind of scares some of us, right? Because we don't sometimes know what exactly picking up that cross means. And some of us don't get very excited about picking up that cross daily and carrying that responsibility that we're called to bear. Because let's be honest, life isn't all sunshine and roses, right? It's not always easy. And when we're picking up that cross, we're going to come to times where we struggle to move forward, where we struggle to carry that load that has been put upon us. And again, it doesn't help when the church moves into theologies like the prosperity gospel that says, you know what, you're all supposed to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. And if you declare anything in God's name, guess what? He's going to grant it for you and you should never struggle or suffer again. Guess what, folks? That's not what the biblical record says at all. In fact, guess what? It says, guess what? You're probably going to lose your life if you truly follow me. But in that process, you will find that you lived a vibrant life. Not a life that's completely free, but a vibrant life. One where you will experience a freedom that you never thought was possible. So this week I sat down at my table and apparently God needed to remind me just how good this adventure that we call our Christian walk really is. And I was just amazed as I sat there and flipped through photos of my family and things that we had done. And I had to just, between the laughs and the cries and everything I had in between, just really come to the moment and thank God that God had called me to be on this adventure and to go and do this. And I thank God that somehow I said yes and went along with it. Because I can tell you one thing, if I would have chosen to go on my own adventure, to go set out on my own path, I wouldn't be standing before you today. And based on the results that I had in my previous life, I'd probably be in a pretty miserable spot right now. Because I was in a miserable spot the last time I tried to go out on an adventure on my own. So friends, today we are going to continue to dig in again to our Star Wars series. And again, I hope that it encourages you to think about your faith and think deeply about it. I hope that it's also going to encourage you to think about what it means for you to be called on an adventure, the heroic venture. And I'm also want you to think about how or what it means for us to call and invite others to be a part of that. Okay? So go to the next verse, Dale. And so, friends, again, Jesus continues with this in 25 and 26, and he says, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, so the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his glory." So there are consequences to the things that we do. And it's unfortunate that I think that more and more people now have chosen to leave the church because they haven't found enough value in it. And again, perhaps it's our fault that we haven't encouraged and inspired enough of their potential and possibility to be part of our churches. And as a result, they're going out into the world looking for other worldviews that they think that they can contribute to in a meaningful way. And yet, what is the result that we're seeing? We're seeing more confusion, chaos, and conflict than perhaps at any other time in our life. We seem to be more unhappy now than we have in the past. Okay? And so what good does it do us then to go out and to go out on adventures on our own, if you will, and pursue all of the things of the world, only to find that we have lost ourselves in the very process? Okay, Dale, go ahead. So we are going to watch a clip right now from the newest Star Wars trilogy. This comes from the movie The Force Awakens, okay? And we're going to watch the trailer on this because I think it sets up and expresses this idea of the heroic journey. So I invite you just to hopefully enjoy this and participate along. Now, again, if you're not a Star Wars fan, I get that it's kind of like, yeah, okay. But I want to tell you guys how excited most Star Wars fans were when that trailer came out, okay? That trailer ignited fans from across generations. And why is that? Because it invited them to re-explore the fantasy world that they loved, right? It invited them to be part of the films and to be part of the very adventure itself. itself. And I love in there in that phrase where you hear Rey's voice and she says, there are stories, right? And then you hear Han Solo say, you know what? It's all true. All of it. Now, what do we know, just as a little aside here, what do we know about Han Solo? Was he the person that believed in all of this stuff? No, because in the very first movie, isn't he the same guy that proclaims, hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster? It's all a lot of simple tricks and nonsense, right? So you have the sort of atheist rebel person that is Han Solo, and you look at the character, the hero that he becomes as a result of being surrounded by people that show their true heroic leadership. And so today, friends, I want us to spend a little bit of time looking at the stories and looking at what we will call this hero's journey, if you will, okay? And in order to do that, we have to go in and we have to talk a little bit about mythology, because the hero's journey is really bedded in mythology, okay? Now, again, some of you are already going, okay, where are you going with this, Pastor Josh? So let me just be very clear and direct, and I will just say this so there's no confusion. The biblical stories are not myths, okay? But many of the biblical stories use a mythological framework, especially with regard to hero stories, because they often have the same characteristics in circle that they go through, and we'll explore that in a little bit later. So anyway, as we talk about mythology, then, we have to understand that Joseph Campbell, who was a professor of literature, has done an amazing study on mythology, of the stories from cultures all across the world. And he found then that despite all of the diversity in these cultures, that these hero stories, whether it's of the ancient gods and goddesses or whether it's of actual people, that many of these stories share the same forms and pieces to go through. And so as he did this, he divided it into what we'll call three acts, three main acts. And it's an act of departure, an act of initiation, and an act of return, okay? And then within that, he developed 17 other stages that these hero characters will sometimes often go through. Now, they don't go through all 17, and each story is a little bit variable in how they do it. Go to the next slide, Dale. So what I want us to do this morning, and I'm scared to touch this thing because I'm afraid it's going to tip over, but I want us to go through and work through the hero story from a Star Wars perspective, but also a biblical perspective, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw, and you have to bear with me because I am by no means an artist here, all right? And of course, I grabbed the bad marker. So we are going to make a dotted line here then, and we're going to call this the known. And underneath this, the larger part of this circle, we're going to call the unknown. All right? And we'll make a little stick figure here because that's all I'm capable of drawing. And so that will be our heroic character of Rey from the newest Star Wars trilogy and the character of Esther. I figured we'd stick with strong feminine heroes this morning in lieu of Mother's Day. So one of the things then that Campbell has talked about is that there's this idea of departure, this departure from what is known, from this ordinary life, okay? And so we'll just put that here, that there's a call to adventure here. Now for Rey in Star Wars, she gets wound up in this grand story that begins to unfold, and she finds herself trying to save this small droid and going to a new planet, and she's given this very specific call by none other than Han Solo, Solo himself, and he says, you know what, why don't you be a part of this thing? Why don't you come and adventure? Because I think you have the skills to do it. Now, the thing about Rey is that, like many characters, she's a nobody, right? Or at least that's what we're led to believe at the very beginning of the story. She's just this little orphan girl who lives on this absolutely desolate planet and is just doing everything that she can to survive. And she's, the unique thing about her, I think, or the beautiful characteristic about her, is that she has this amazing sense of hope. She still, after all of these years, after being orphaned as just a little girl, now in her teenage years, still has hope that her family will return to her. And so she denies the call to adventure and says, you know what, I can't go on an adventure because I need to go back and look and wait for my parents. Now, Esther, in the story of the Old Testament, too, gets this call to adventure, but rather than actually having a choice, she too just finds herself sort of caught up in this grand story that God is telling. Because again, who is Esther? Well, in many ways, she's a nobody, right? She's just a little orphan Jewish girl who is just living her life with her aunt and uncle, when all of a sudden she finds herself swept into the Persian king's court and into his palace, and she becomes a queen, right? And it's nothing that she could do. And so for her, we might say then that the call is God's providence, right? And God moves her and directs her out of this life that is known and into the unknown, right? And so often then here we have this place here, right at the dotted line, where the characters cross over, and this is the initiation phase. Right? And this is where they begin to have to grow, and they face challenges, they'll find mentors, and a whole bunch of different things as they go through. And again, this isn't always easy, because oftentimes they're confronted with their demons or their opponents. And so in Rey, we find her initiated into this story. She's given Luke's lightsaber, a tool to go out and go on this adventure, and she goes and finds Luke Skywalker as a mentor for her to help her traverse this period. But along the way, she learns and takes on the responsibility of what it means to be a hero, of what it means to be a Force user in the Star Wars universe. And oftentimes, she learns her greatest activities from the confrontations she has with the main villain, who is Kylo Ren. Now, Kylo Ren was the guy with the black mask, and interestingly enough, if you've never seen it, that also happens to be Han and Leia's son. Okay, so that puts a real twist on things in terms of the overarching storyline. Now, Esther, as she gets here, also undergoes an initiation, and if you read the scriptures, you'll find that she had to spend a lot of time preparing just to go to the king. She had to learn how to be a lady, so to speak, had to learn how to use perfumes and oils and all of the things that were in it. And so she too has to take on this responsibility of learning how to be a lady in the king's court. Okay? Now, eventually, both characters succeed, and they move to this point in the myth, oftentimes, which is called the abyss. Okay? Or sometimes it's called the belly of the whale. But essentially, this is almost what's called the descent into hell. Okay, this is the period where the character is basically now tested and tried in everything that they have learned on this part of the story. And so for Rey, at the end of the movies, we see her go to this dark planet called Exegol, where she faces essentially the epitome of evil itself, which is the resurrected Emperor Palpatine. Okay, and she has such an ordeal that it literally costs her life. Okay? And so she literally dies in what might be called hell. Okay? Now, Esther doesn't have quite so much a dramatic experience. But if we read verse 4, and it's one of the most beautiful couple of verses, I think, in the entire book, all of a sudden there's this threat by the king's second in command, Haman, and he has basically created a decree that says that he has the ability to go and kill all of the Jewish people. Okay? And her mentor, her uncle Mordecai, basically comes to her and says, you know what, you can sit here in the palace in silence, but don't think you're going to escape the fate of what is about to happen. And then he says some of the most beautiful words ever. You were made for such a time and place as this. Okay? And I just love that, because I think about that. Think about that even in terms of our own lives. Again, some of us don't like the adventure that we're called on, but what if we live that? That God created us for such a time and a place as this, and has given us a responsibility for this day, for this time. Now, her abyss is the fact that as she has prepared and waited on God's timing for this, God instructs her to go into the king's court. Now, in the ancient Persia, no one could come into the king's court unless they were invited by the king himself. And so by her going into the court uninvited, she risks death. She puts her life on the line that she might go and try to persuade the king, because the time is nearing that Haman's decree will begin. Now, luckily for her, she goes into that darkness and she's able to come out, right? Because the king extends the scepter to her and invites her to come and to speak. Now, over here, we're going to put another part, and we're going to call this atonement. And this can sometimes be for the character themselves, or it can be for other people. So the atonement in Ray's case is not the fact that she's fallen to some darkness, but she has died. The atonement comes in the form of Kylo Ren, who willingly, because of the impact that she has had on his life, saves her. He gives his life force to her in an act of atonement that then brings him fully back to the light side of the Force. All right? And the same for Esther then, that because of her courage, because of her willingness to be used by God, she is able to save her Jewish people. She's able to then write a reversal, if you will, of the decree that Haman wrote that allows the Jews to protect themselves and therefore atones for all of the things that goes on. And then finally up here, friends, our final stage is the return. All right, and so there's this, in some ways then, this return to normalcy, or return to what is known. All right, and so in Star Wars we see this play over and over again, and in Rey's case, she now has this understanding of the Force, right? She's now been completely trained, she's dealt with all of the trials, she now returns to her life as sort of a normal person, and her job now is to share with the community what she has learned. And so now she gains the responsibility to train another generation of Jedi, okay? Now, Esther's return is a little bit different. She goes on and she returns as the wise queen. But what's interesting is that as you finish the book of Esther, she just kind of fades out of the picture. She just kind of goes back into the known and just disappears. But because of what she did here, her uncle Mordecai is able to come up, and he actually assumes the place that Haman had. He becomes second in command of the king. And so because of her return, she's able to rule in wisdom, and the Jewish people are saved from their fate, and they're able to continue and go on. And so, friends, we can see this theme time and time again throughout Scripture. And next week, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking more about Christ, but Christ is like the penultimate hero, right? Again, I'm not saying the story of Christ is a myth. Please don't hear that. I'm really worried that people are going to take it that way. But think about that. Christ gets the call to leave the harmony, the divine harmony, the dance of the three in one, to come down incarnated into a corrupted flesh. He deals with all of the temptations and trials. He dies for us, descends literally into hell, rises back up so that we have the atonement, so that we are made right with God the Father, and then ascends and returns to heaven to be with the Father and the Spirit once more. If you'll go to the next slide. And so, friends, I want us to really to think about this as we go through our week. And maybe for some of you, you think this idea of the hero's journey is a little bit corny, and maybe it is. But friends, we're invited to experience a vibrant life. The life of a Christian isn't boring. It's not easy, but it's not boring. And I think, to go back to our initial conversation, that sometimes that's what people think it is, because that's the life that we sometimes portray to other people. But the journey that we're on is about our possibility. It's about our potential. It's about who we become in Christ. Okay? We are to be conformed to the image of Christ. We're called to pick up that cross and carry it daily. And then we're called to share what we have learned and who we have become with our neighbors. All right? Now, friends, I want to challenge you with one last thing here, and that is, what if instead of saying or making all these easy way outs and just saying, you know what, Christ is just an add-on to our life, what if we said to follow Christ requires giving everything we have? How might that change the way that we live? How might it change the way that we think? Now, friends, I'm not saying that necessarily we have to give up everything all at once, but I can say from experience that the more deeply you begin to step into that faith, the more God calls from you, and the more you realize that you have more and more to give, and the things that you used to think were really important really aren't quite so important as the things that He is calling you to do. Dale, last slide. So, friends, from Paul, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will and His good and pleasing perfect will is. So, friends, let us not be afraid to take on the journey that God calls us to, because, again, that's what our life is. Our life should be a constant call and response to God. Over and over, this should play out. And so, friends, let us continually conform to the image of Christ and not to the image of this world. And let us invite others into this adventure that we call Christianity. Dale, final slide. So some action steps for you. Are you willing to heed the call to adventure? And if you are, where are you on the journey? And friends, again, we might look at our entire life as one of these cycles, but also along the way, there's lots of mini cycles where we might go through the same thing, lots of little adventures that prepare us for the thing. So where are you in your current adventure? What's the next step that you need to take? And will you give it everything you've got? God bless you guys.